Hello, and today we're reviewing the Greenworks CS48L4411 48-volt 16-inch brushless battery-operated chainsaw. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot, and it's an interesting showing here because there's actually two of them. This particular tool is going to make full use of Greenworks' 24-volt batteries, but it's going to need two of them in order to, well, operate the tool. One battery will not turn on the tool, and you will need two. Second of all, well, those two batteries are going to have to be the exact same amperage. You can't mix and match, so if you have a 4 amp hour battery and a 2 amp hour battery, it's not going to be a pleasant experience for you, and you will need to have two 4 amp hour batteries to make this tool operate. And third of all, well, 2 probably isn't going to be enough for a medium-sized project. Say you're cutting down a medium-sized tree. It may be enough to get you through the majority of your project, but I find having 4 batteries on hand is definitely far better than only having 2 batteries on hand, because this thing will drain batteries incredibly quickly because it's a bit of a power hog. But that's for a good reason. This particular tool has quite a bit more speed and torque than some of the other battery chainsaws that I've operated, including Ryobi's 40-volt chainsaws lineup. So it's actually quite a decent little chainsaw as long as you realize just how much power it needs in order to maintain its performance. So as long as you keep those things in mind, this particular tool is actually fairly attractive when it comes to its sheer amount of speed and power. And when it comes to the battery slots, they're acceptable enough. I haven't had any issues with the tool losing power or batteries falling free in use, and that's going to be fairly good because, well, chainsaws are usually a tool that you end up operating at odd or weird positions because, well, let's face it, we don't always follow all the safety guidelines that are set down by manufacturers or the government or regulations or OSHA or all that. So quite frankly, it's very important that the batteries stay in place. And they do, but there is quite a bit of looseness and play to speak of, but not enough to affect the overall operation of the tool, so it's good enough. But on a future model, I would like to see this eliminated. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the tool. Okay, next up we have the chain brake. Now the chain brake is located in front of the forward handle and is going to basically just be a giant safety feature, which is the equivalent to a giant on and off switch. When the chain brake is pulled backward towards yourself, that means that the chainsaw will be able to operate normally. But if the chainsaw starts to get away from you or bucks or hits something, it should push forward, causing the chainsaw to turn off instantaneously, meaning that there's less of a chance that you're going to end up injuring yourself. Keyword here is less of a chance. You should always maintain safety, protocols when operating a chainsaw and practice best methods for, well, safe operation. So just keep that in mind. If you can't figure out why your chainsaw isn't turning on after you put 2 fresh batteries in it, make sure that you check your chain brake and make sure it's in the operational position, because a lot of times it can get bumped forward and you'll be trying to figure out if your chainsaw is broken until you remember the safety feature because you previously operated an electric chainsaw that didn't have this for a very long period of time and you're still a little bit confused by the fact that this particular safety function exists. For those of you who are new to electric chainsaws with this particular feature, if you've operated a gas chainsaw, there's a good chance you've seen something similar to this already. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety, and unfortunately we have a bit of a problem here. The safety on this particular chainsaw is definitely meant for a right-handed user. This is not going to be a universal safety because, well, it's designed so that you will access it with basically your right thumb because it's only visible on one side of the chainsaw. So that's definitely a few points against this particular chainsaw because it's not exactly left-handed friendly. Now, you could say that a lot of chainsaws aren't because of the wraparound handle on top, and they're really meant more for a right-handed user base, which is true enough, but generally you'll find that safeties on chainsaws are fairly universal, and quite frankly, I would have liked to have seen a better design here. So yeah, not the greatest showing there. And when it comes to the trigger, that's kind of another weak point. It's functional and it gets the job done. And it is variable speed, but it can be rather hard to maintain the different speeds or keeping your chainsaw set to a certain speed because there just isn't that much resistance on the trigger, and it's super easy to just go to max speed instantaneously every single time. So the trigger is definitely something else that needs some work. The variable speeds need to be spaced out a little bit more, and there definitely needs to be more resistance when you're pulling on the trigger to help you maintain, your speeds at different, well, speeds. So overall, this particular chainsaw's safety and trigger could definitely use some improvements in the future, and I hope that if we ever get a second version of this particular chainsaw, they take these comments to heart. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the tool. Okay, next up we have the forward grip and the rear grip. Now the forward grip on this particular tool is actually fairly nice. I actually like the design of it. It's basically a twisty plastic that's basically twisting as it goes across, and it's fairly nice. And I like the design that it makes it feel like you have a little bit more control over it. It's a little bit harder for your hands to slip. There's no foam or rubberized texture on the forward handle, and it's all hard plastic, but I'm actually fine with that because it makes me feel like I have a little bit more control over the tool, so no complaints there. Now the rear handle on this particular tool is adequate enough. It's not too thick, which is good, but they definitely kind of skimped out on the rubberized texture, and I definitely feel like they should have given you a little bit more rubberized texture back here. But at the end of the day, it's still a fairly comfortable tool regardless of what sized hands you have, so no real complaints there either. So the handles on this particular tool are just fine. The ergonomics seem to be as good as on any other chainsaw, so quite frankly I'm perfectly satisfied with the designs here. Moving on. Okay, next up we have Stupid Designs 101, starting off with the oil tank. Actually, this is going to pretty much be the whole segment. Now, this oil tank is so stupid on so many different levels, so I've decided to go through a list of reasons why this is an idiotic design and should never be repeated on any tool ever again. First up, we have the cap flip up grip or handle. This particular cap is designed to be low profile, which means it's not going to get caught on things, which is good in principle, but in actual reality, this means that it's going to be incredibly hard to get a good grip on it, and it also means that if it sits out in the sun for any period of time, it will start to become brittle, and there's a high chance that it can break. So it's just not a great design because you can't get a good amount of leverage on it, and it can be prone to breaking because it's thin plastic. Second of all, the cap itself is on a keeper, which keeps it basically attached to the chainsaw, which on paper may seem like a good idea, but in reality that's not the case. In reality, it gets in the way when you're trying to add oil to the tank or remove oil from the tank once you get done using the tool. So it's just basically a way to make a big mess. So quite frankly, this is an easy enough fix. You could just cut it off and take a pair of pliers and remove the inner piece, but it's still a stupid design and shouldn't be something that the user necessarily needs to deal with. So yeah, stupid design. Third of all, it is a recessed cap, which means in principle it's a lower profile, which should be good, except for when you need to add or subtract oil from the tank. So this also means that, well, basically you're going to get oil everywhere, and it also means that debris and other things are going to fall into the tank since there's no spout area on the cap itself to keep debris from, well, basically falling into the interior of your tank, which could clog up your oiling system. It's not a good design. Do not make recessed caps on oil tanks. It's not a gas tank, it's an oil tank. Keep a bit of a area that, you know, a bit of a spout so that when you need to pour the oil out of the tank, you can do that back into the container, because at the end of the day, whatever leftover bar oil you have needs to be put back into its original container or into another container. So it needs a spout in that regard. You can make it a wide spout, but you need some sort of a spout in order to make this an easier process and to make sure that you're not wasting oil or getting oil everywhere. And quite frankly, that brings us to the next fact, that it's an offset tank, which means adding the proper amount of liquid to the tank can be a bit of a tricky problem. So this is also an irritant because it's mounted at an angle. Don't put your caps at an angle on an oil tank. So, quite frankly, there are so many things that are stupid about this particular design that it just is unfathomable that they actually ended up releasing this particular chainsaw with this design. Was their competition brought in to design the oil tank? I mean, seriously, this is so incredibly stupid on every level. So, quite frankly, the oil tank on this particular tool needs a complete redesign, and it's atrocious in every sense of the word. I cannot find any redeeming qualities in this particular oil tank, and I hate it with a burning passion of 1,000 dying suns. So with that being said, the oiling system on this particular chainsaw is quite adequate and might actually give the chain too much oil in actual operations. But that is up to the individual user, but for me personally, I think they could have had a little bit less oil being sprayed onto the chain. So with that being said, let's move on to the next aspect of this particular tool and get away from this monstrosity abomination of a design. And next up we have the bucking spikes. They're made out of plastic and they're really not all that useful, but honestly I don't find them to be all that useful in most scenarios anyway on electric chainsaws, so yeah, it is what it is. They're made out of plastic. It would have been better if they were metal, but it's not really that big of a deal because they're just not all that useful on electric chainsaws. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the socket cover as well as the two bolts that hold on the cover and bar and the tensioning screw that it's all hooked into, and it's a fairly simple system. Now the first thing you want to do, unlike what I'm doing in the video right now, is to remove your batteries. You should not loosen anything up on the chainsaw until you have removed your batteries. So make sure that you remove your batteries first, and then you can, well, loosen up the bolts that hold everything together. Now when you need to adjust the tension of the chain, you want to loosen up the two bolts on the chainsaw, and then you will be able to start to turn the screw that is in between the two. Once you have them properly loosened, you don't need to take them off, you just need to loosen them up a bit. Then you can start to turn the screw that's on the inside, and then you will be able to adjust the tension of the chain. Once you figure out exactly where you need to have the tension at, then you can go ahead and tighten down the two bolts again, and then, well, everything should be back together once you have those two bolts tight, and then you can put the batteries back in and resume operation of the chainsaw. In use, I haven't had any major issues with the chain becoming super loose or the chain becoming detached from the bar, so quite frankly I've been fairly happy with the overall design on this particular chainsaw, and everything seems to work fairly well, and they seem to have used a fairly good quality of bolts and nuts on their retention setup here, so I'm fairly happy with all of that. The one area on this particular tool, like I was saying earlier or at the start of this video, is, well, they didn't give us anywhere to put the wrench on the tool. Why? This is such a nice feature on a lot of different chainsaws, especially from Ryobi, where you can store the wrench on the tool, and that means in the field there's less of a chance you're going to end up losing it, and you will always know where it's at, and it's the proper size that fits the chainsaw. So this is an area of the tool I wish that they would improve upon in the future. Okay, continuing on. Now the bolts that hold everything onto the chainsaw themselves are actually retained within the cover of the tool, which means that they're never going to get lost because they can't fall free or fall out, which is going to be a super nice feature when you need to adjust things or clean things in the field. So that is definitely a bonus. Now once you get inside the cover, or take the cover off I should say, you can go ahead and clean out all the other debris or gunk that has built up while the tool has been in operation, and you should probably do that pretty much every single time you get done operating the chainsaw for proper tool maintenance. But you know, not everybody does that, which is okay I guess, but I personally like cleaning it fairly regularly. Now everything here, it seems to be fairly decent. The two metal studs that hold the bar on into place seem to be fairly robust, and the sprocket itself is made out of metal. There's a wide area to get the oil onto the chain, and this particular chainsaw definitely has no problems, well, not putting enough oil onto the chain, so fairly happy with that as well. The chain and bar themselves seem to be fairly universal up to the point. Just make sure you get the proper pitch and angle and all that right if you need to put a new chain or blade on this particular chainsaw, and Greenworks does sell replacement parts if you so choose to. But I'm sure somebody out there will gerrymander this thing with some larger bar or blade and void their warranty, but whatever the case that may be, you do that to yourself. For me personally, I usually like sticking with the stock, you know, parts that come with the tool, unless they no longer make those parts. But for the most part, all the internals in here seem to work very well, and I don't really have any major complaints. The tensioning system works very well, and everything seems to be of a fairly decent quality here. Not the highest quality, but it's definitely better than what you'll find on some other more budget branded chainsaws, or pretty much anything you buy off Amazon that isn't branded with a recognizable name. So at the end of the day, I'm fairly happy with everything here, and everything else seems to go back together fairly easily, so no complaints there either. And when you're putting everything back together, just make sure you get everything to line up, make sure you get the tensioning screw to go through the hole in the bar, and you get the bar cover over the hole on the tensioning screw, and everything should be, well, perfectly fine. I didn't notice any ugly surprises while assembling or disassembling the cover or bar or chain on this particular chainsaw, and it all went back together fairly easily. If you've never done it before, it can take you a little bit of time to get it right, but once you get the hang of it, it's a fairly easy, you know, thing to adjust or work on. So I think Greenworks actually did a fairly good job on this particular area of the tool, and so I have no major complaints here, and everything went back together as intended without any ugly surprises. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the last aspect of this particular tool. Oh, and Greenworks, please make sure that you, in the future, make sure you include an onboard wrench, not an off-board wrench for your future models. Okay, moving on. Okay, next up we have the bar and chain, and I don't really see any major problems with the overall quality here. It does seem to be a little bit thinner, and the chain seems to be a little bit thinner, but that does seem to usually be the case on these electric chainsaws, so no real problems there. But just keep in mind that this might not work with an off-the-shelf replacement from your local big box store, and you might have to special order a replacement chain or bar with this particular chainsaw. Now, with that being said, unfortunately they did kind of shortchange us when it comes to the overall length of the bar. The bar is a 16-inch bar, but of that 16 inches, you have 15 inches of usable space, not a true 16 inches of usable space. So a little bit of a short change there, but that's pretty common with most of these electric chainsaw manufacturers. The included bar and chain come out to be about 15 inches in usable space. So yeah, just something to be aware of. Pretty normal for an electric chainsaw manufacturer. I've seen this issue with several other manufacturers on the market, so it is what it is. But with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the weight of the tool. Okay, without a battery, the chainsaw weighs 3,843 grams, which is going to be about 8.5 pounds. And with two 4 amp hour 24 volt batteries, the weight increases to 5,394 grams, which is going to be just shy of 12 pounds. So it's a heavy little bugger when it's fully loaded out. Okay, real quickly, let's talk about this chainsaw in use. I have to say, even with its shortcomings, it's still a nice little chainsaw to use. It has plenty of speed and plenty of power, and it actually does a fairly nice job and a quick job in most regards. My biggest complaint would definitely be the oil tank on this particular chainsaw, but the fact it doesn't have an onboard wrench, and, well, also the fact that it just isn't the lightest weight tool in the world is definitely a bit of a downside. But for the most part, it has plenty of torque and speed, and it definitely is quicker than some of my other battery-operated chainsaws. As a matter of fact, my only other chainsaw that is faster than this particular chainsaw would be my Greenworks 80-volt chainsaw. So, quite frankly, I'm pretty thrilled with the overall performance that this particular chainsaw is giving us, and with the fact that it can use your standard power tool batteries from the Greenworks power tool lineup, means that this can be a very attractive tool for several reasons. But then again, it can be a very unattractive tool for several reasons. So it's really going to be up to you. But with that being said, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. And the first pro would be 24-volt batteries. This uses the same batteries that your Greenworks 24-volt power tools use, and this means that you won't have to buy into a whole new tool battery system in order to have a chainsaw that is fairly decent. So this is a pro in my opinion. 48 volt. 48 volt is definitely a unique voltage in the power tool world, but it is super useful, and you can definitely see the improvements over this particular tool compared to a Ryobi 40-volt chainsaw. So this is a pro in my opinion. Power. Overall, this particular chainsaw has quite a bit of torque and speed to work with. While it's still no gas chainsaw and it can't outclass 60 or 80 volt chainsaws, this thing is definitely more powerful than several other chainsaws in its price category, so this is a pro in my opinion. Chain brake. Overall, the chain brake is a super useful safety feature and can come in handy. Just remember not to overly rely on it for your own safety. 16 inches. While in reality that's really actually only 15 inches, it's still better than a 12-inch chainsaw, which in reality is usually really only 11 inches. So having this 15 inches is still better than having, well, 11 inches. So this is a pro in my opinion. Cover bolts. The cover bolts that are built into the cover means that you won't have to worry about them falling and getting lost in the dirt. So this is a pro in my opinion. Speed. Overall, this is a fairly fast chainsaw, and this chain speed is quite good on this particular model. So if you need something that has quite a bit of speed, this isn't a half-bad option to look at in this particular category. Solid handle. Overall, I really like the forward handle in this particular chainsaw. I like the design and pattern and angles that they went with. Overall, I feel like I have very good control over this chainsaw, so this is a pro in my opinion. And the first and only meh would be the plastic bumper spikes. They would have been better if they were metal, but they're plastic. But honestly, on a chainsaw like this, it really doesn't matter all that much. So in my opinion, this is just kind of meh. And the first and major con would be the oil tank. The oil tank on this is just an absolute disaster. I'm not quite sure what they were thinking, but it was clearly obviously that they weren't thinking. Overall, this is definitely a major con and almost a flat out no for me for this particular chainsaw. But at the end of the day, it's something you can kind of live with. So yeah, the oil tank is just a major con in my opinion. No onboard wrench. This is another area where they stopped thinking. I'm not sure why they did not include an onboard wrench, but this definitely makes it a pain to adjust things when you're out in the field. So this is an area of the tool I wish they would improve upon in the future. Variable speed trigger. Overall, the variable speed trigger on this particular saw is not that great. There isn't enough resistance and the speeds aren't properly spaced out. So this is an area of the tool that could also use some improvement in the future. Battery life. Overall, this thing goes through batteries very quickly. Now, that is because it's providing a lot of power and speed, but it is something that you need to be aware of, and I would highly recommend owning at least 4 24-volt batteries, and ideally you would need 6, but that's just my own opinion, and your own usage may vary. And last but not least, lefty unfriendly. Having the safety only accessible really on the right side is definitely not an ideal approach when you're trying to design a tool that will, well, be marketable to the vast majority of people on the market. So in my opinion, this is a bit of a con. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular chainsaw. This chainsaw has a lot going for it, it has a lot going against it. Overall, if you are in the Greenworks 24-volt system and you want something that's slightly bigger and has more power than your 12-inch chainsaw that they offer, this is not a half-bad option, especially if you really don't want to buy into a whole new battery lineup or, you know, tool line. So, quite frankly, I do like a lot that this chainsaw has to offer. The speed's good, the torque's good, the overall build quality seems to be fairly good, but they just went with some really stupid designs, like no onboard wrench, and the oil tank is absolutely atrocious. So, as long as you can live with its shortcomings, this tool does come recommended. Now, the one other negative I didn't actually mention, because I forgot to put it in the, you know, pros and cons section, was the price. This thing can be rather expensive if you buy it new. You can find it usually on discount or on clearance a lot of the time at different retailers or as renewed or open box specials, and if you pick it up that way, that's not a half bad way to go either. Just make sure you test it out thoroughly if you do end up buying it that way. But at the end of the day, it really is going to be up to you and your own personal needs and preferences. Overall, this is a fairly large chainsaw, so I think for the vast majority of people it might just be too much. But if you do have a little bit of land and you live somewhere where you have to routinely deal with downed trees or limbs, this isn't a half bad tool to have on hand, and it definitely will be more handy than a smaller 12-inch chainsaw. So this tool comes recommended as long as you know what you're getting into. And you don't mind paying the price and having a funnel on hand when you need to drain the oil tank. So yeah, it's for certain people, but for the vast majority of people, probably not the best tool. So yeah, we will see you all next time. God bless.